In our last lesson, we looked at shunting blood around the body. We saw that by selectively constricting or relaxing different parts of the blood system, the circulatory system, we can direct blood to different parts of the body. So if we constricted the muscular arteries going to the muscles and relax the arteries going to the gut, then we can selectively increase digestion and decrease blood flow to the muscles. Now, the reason this was important was because we wanted to reduce the total amount of fluid that we've got in our circulatory system. Now, we wanted to do that in order to reduce the strain on the heart. If we've got a lot of fluid flowing back into the heart, that's going to put a big preload on the heart. That means there's going to be a lot of blood coming back here. There's a lot of blood now that needs to be pumped back out again into the circulation, which means that the heart is going to have to contract harder, so stroke volume will have to increase, and we're probably going to need to increase our heart rate a little bit in order to maintain a very high pressure here in the aorta. Probably a higher pressure than what we needed before, because there's so much more fluid needing to drain through this system to different parts of the body and return. And with each branching, the pressure will drop. So the more branches we have, the higher initial pressure that we need so that we can maintain a reasonable level of blood flow to those areas. Now, to compensate, we can strengthen up the muscles of the heart, which are doing the contracting, and we've done that. The ventricle is strong. We've increased muscle strength to it so it can beat, but we're still straining the heart. Now, with this system, we gave it to our clients to have a look at, and we gave them a few modules that they could install themselves to have a play with. Now, one of those ones was the brain. They've installed a brain here, and they didn't have a lot of room to play with vasoconstriction and vasodilation, because the brain does need a relatively constant supply of blood. Now, the next module they tried to install was the lungs, and they've come back to us at this point because they're having all sorts of problems with the lungs. Forget about the fact that oxygen doesn't dissolve well in blood to begin with. That's a different problem that we fixed that I'll tell you about some other time. But for now, the problem is that they're not getting enough oxygen to the tissues, and very importantly, they're not getting rid of carbon dioxide, which the muscles are generating, which the body is generating. We are a carbon-based life form. Carbon forms the backbone of the organic molecules of our body. So when we're using them up, we're generating a lot of carbon that we're trying to get out of the body via carbon dioxide. The problem is that changes the acidity of the blood, makes it acidic. And the more acidic the blood is, the more enzymes stop functioning, and the entire function of the body starts to collapse. So gas exchange is becoming a real problem in this system. So let's have a look at what they've done, where the problem is, and maybe how we can help them. They've installed, just like we told them, another system of artery and veins, and they've hooked it up to the lungs. Now, in this diagram, I've got 4 different systems, all demanding blood. That means that without doing anything else, at any one time, 1/4 of the circulation is going to be going through the lungs, which means that at any one time, out of a potential 100% saturation of the blood with oxygen or 100% ability to remove carbon dioxide, only 1/4 of that is being realized, which means that 3/4 of the blood is oxygen deficient. which means that the body's becoming hypoxic. It's not getting enough oxygen. Not only that, 3/4 of the blood is actually filling up with carbon dioxide and changing the acidity. Now, we know that we can shunt blood. Now, we could constrict muscles, we could constrict the gut, and we could even try to constrict the brain in order to shunt blood to the lungs so that we can increase the amount of blood passing through the lungs and therefore increase the ability to pick up oxygen and to get rid of carbon dioxide. Now, as soon as we do that, number one, we've decreased blood supply to the brain. The person's fainted. So that didn't work. We need to reopen blood supply to the brain. We shut down quite heavily, we clamped down on blood supply to the muscles. Okay? Now that did increase circulation to the lungs a little bit, but the problem is the person just felt so lazy, they had no strength, they didn't want to get out of their chair. We really messed up this system in order to push blood to the lungs. Now, same with the gut. We've constricted circulation to the gut in order to push it to the lungs to try and increase this fraction of blood going to the lungs. And digestion's pretty much stopped. People feel like they've got a brick in their guts. It's not a very good state at the moment. And not only that, the amount of blood that is now coming to the lungs has increased, but not enough. We're still got hypoxic tissues, not getting enough oxygen, and we're still changing the acidity of the blood because of that carbon dioxide that is building up inside it. Now, if we want to get 100% of the blood, 100% of our ability to oxygenate the blood realized, and 100% of our ability to get rid of carbon dioxide realized, then the solution should be quite simple. Pass all of the blood through it. So let's do that. I'm going to take out this last circuit I built. And here, where I've got these 3 blood vessels, I'm going to join them up. Like so. So all the blood coming out of the heart is going into the lungs. 100% of the ability to oxygenate and to decarbonate the blood is being realized. When I turn the system on and I test it, I find I'm getting all sorts of problems. People are fainting again, the muscles there are not working properly, the people are feeling very lazy, they don't want to move, they haven't got the strength to move, they still feel like they've got a brick in their guts. And the reason is that all of this pressure here that I use for the entire system, I needed to break down very quickly to a low pressure system. If I sent this blood into the lungs under high pressure, I would have blown the lungs to bits. So I needed to very quickly drop that pressure. I did it by branching my arteries very quickly, trying to drop that pressure down so that blood moves around the lungs at a nice speed. Now once it's done that, we're into the venous system, where pressure is very, very low. That's your venous system. And that should be part of your arterial system. Now, pressure coming out of here is incredibly low. I need to try and feed that pressure through 3 systems of the body and bring it back to the heart. If I've already lost most of my blood pressure, then I've got very little room to play with in order to keep blood moving. And we'll have a look at a little graph later so I can explain that in a little more detail. But the simple fact is that the flow of blood has been compromised. It's coming out of here very sluggishly, and it still has to pass through another organ. and that's not working very well at all. Sure, I've achieved the perfusion that I wanted, but it's been at the expense of everything else. So this is a huge problem. This is potentially an unsolvable problem. So this is beyond me. I've called in everyone else that knows anything about anatomy and physiology to try and help me here in this problem. And after about an hour's worth of discussion, someone threw out a wild card and they said, well, why don't you create a second heart and just dedicate it to the lungs, so that we restore the first heart to the way it was, and we have an entirely different system feeding into the lungs and feeding out of the lungs. Now that does sound possible, as opposed to everything else which has been absolutely implausible and doesn't work. So let's have a look at that. I'm taking the lungs out of this circuit. I'm going to create another heart just for the lungs. Actually, I might get it feeding in the other side. It looks like it's going to be jammed up here. There's my atrium, there's my ventricle. Okay, so this blood is going to come out the ventricle. It's going to go to the lungs. And it's going to go back into the atrium to form a little system. Now there's an immediate problem, isn't there? That this blood that is going around and around in this system here has no way of getting to the muscles and the gut and the brain unless I develop yet another entirely different circulatory system. I want to be able to use these pipes to deliver all that oxygenated blood. So this is quite straightforward actually. With just a little bit of trickery, I'm going to bring this blood back here, and this blood will be here. So I'm going to take out these arteries, or these veins, sorry. Let's see if I get this right. And I'm going to have to hook them up to here. So let's see if this path works. Okay, so I've got blood from the lungs coming back into, well, I'll call this the left side, the left atrium, going down into the left ventricle. This blood will be 100% oxygenated, hopefully, or 100% of the capacity, or close to. Hopefully it's got rid of all the carbon dioxide. The heart's going to be, the ventricle's going to be, it's going to push blood out into the organs of our body, which is good. In order to complete the circuit now, we have to drain it back into, now we'll call this a right atrium, and we'll call this the right ventricle. Now that little hook up there does work, in theory. Now, when I test my system though, I start running into problems. The problem that I'm running into is that I'm getting fluid on the lungs. The person is end up, they're drowning in their own fluid. Too much fluid is being dumped from this circuit into the lungs. So let's have a look at why that is happening, because it's quite a difficult idea. In order to get blood around the body, I needed to create a high pressure system. So if we say this is 0, and this up here is high. And we needed that blood to flow over a large distance. All of those tangle of blood vessels, if we lay them end to end, that's a massive distance that the blood has to travel over. So I'm going to call this distance here, I'm going to write like that, I'm going to call that D for distance. And blood will flow from high pressure to low pressure. So at the end of the distance, it will be flowing into a low pressure area. If I join those up here, the slope of this line is going to tell you the speed that the blood is flowing at. Obviously, if I've got a very high pressure on one and very low pressure on the other, the blood is going to hammer through that system from high to low. So imagine someone sliding down that. They're going to be going pretty fast down there. Okay. Now I've copied that heart and I have hooked it up to the lungs. Now, if you think about where the heart is right here. Your lungs are right here. The distance that them blood vessels need to go in order to reach the lungs is not that big. It's only a short distance. So I'm going to call this one D1 now. I'm going to call this second distance D2. Now, I remember I have copied in its entirety that left-hand side of the heart. So there's my finishing pressure, which should be the same height as that pressure. So this height is the same, this one's the same. Distance is smaller. Look at that. The velocity of the blood flowing through is different. It is faster. Now I can't have that in my circulatory system. I can't have blood flowing faster in one area than the other. Because what's going to happen is that it's going to start backing up. The left-hand side of the heart, the blood is moving out at a slower speed, albeit a higher pressure. So if I've got blood trying to race into the heart, and that blood's not moving out as fast, it's going to start backing up inside the pulmonary circuit, inside the circuit that is leading to the lungs. Okay, here's our heart. We've got our left atrium, we've got our left ventricle, we've got our right atrium, we've got our right ventricle. Blood is coming out the right ventricle at a fast speed because the pressure is high and low, but the distance is small. And we saw how that made a steep curve. So let's give it a speed. Let's call it 20 kilometers an hour. Now that's going back into the left-hand side of the heart, which is throwing blood out at a different speed. Let's say it's throwing it out at a slower speed of 10 kilometers per hour. There's going to be a traffic jam here. Now, because there's a traffic jam here, with all this fast blood that is waiting, it's going to start backing up. And when it backs up, there's going to be effusion. There's going to be fluid starting to leak out of the lungs. The capillary and alveoli bed is very thin, and it's going to leak out there into the lungs. And the person is literally going to start drowning in fluid. They're not going to be able to get oxygen in from the air because they're reaching this fluid interface that shouldn't be there. So, I need to compensate for this high pressure. I need to change the pressure in this system. I cannot use the same pressure that I use over here unless I want to destroy my lungs and kill the person. So, one way that I'm creating the high pressure here is by having a large muscular component to the heart, which is increasing stroke volume. It's contracting quite forcefully with a lot of power, and it's punching it up. And of course, the other component is going to be the speed that I'm punching the blood out at. Now, that's the heart rate. Now, in my wisdom, I ended up sewing the right and left sides of the heart together because I thought that would be a good thing to do, which means that I can't really play with heart rate now to try and reduce pressure on one side, not the other. I mean, the heart rate on this side has to be the same as the heart rate on that side because they're joined together. So the only thing I can really change is going to be the stroke volume. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to thin out the muscular layer, the myocardium, of this side of the heart. So it's going to have a thinner edge to it. It's not going to pump as powerfully. As a result, that is going to reduce the pressure on this side. So now my graphs, this side of the heart, high pressure, low pressure. There's the flow speed. There's my distance. This right side of the heart, I'm going to say halve the pressure. There, I'm going to halve the pressure on this side. I've got to halve the distance as well. So, do a little distance. So I've got this D2, I've got this D1, D2. Small pressure. Basically, this pressure line and this one should be the same. So I'm going to play around with pressure until I can make these lines have the same gradient, the same slope. That means they're going to be working at the same speed. So the velocity of the blood isn't going to change. I give that, well, I test that, it works fine, I give it back to the client, and they're happy for now. Thank you.